Welcome to this explainer on sperm jacking and legal loopholes. Today, we're diving straight into a highly debated space where biology, law, and modern culture completely collide. We're going to impartially break down the deep legal and cultural asymmetries surrounding modern reproductive rights exactly as they are presented in this fascinating section of the book. So the author hooks us right away with a pretty jarring paradox. Think about it. While our society rightfully holds sexual consent as an absolutely sacred right, something that needs to be informed, enthusiastic, and ongoing, it seemingly abandons the concept of male consent the exact second conception occurs. The book argues that before conception, both parties absolutely must consent at every single step. But after conception, well, suddenly only one party retains the right to choose the future. And right here, this brilliantly illustrates the author's premise that modern reproductive rights have basically turned into a one-way street. The text suggests that, in our cultural zeal to correct historical injustices against women, which is obviously important, we've inadvertently created a landscape where a man can become a father and face 18 years of strict financial obligation completely without his knowledge, his consent, or his choice. Okay, which brings us to what the text defines as a brand new frontier of reproductive vulnerability. The term used here is sperm jacking. The author describes it as a quiet form of exploitation that our culture rarely even names as a crime. I mean, think about it. In literally any other scenario, taking someone's genetic material without permission would be swiftly prosecuted as theft or fraud. But because it involves reproduction, and specifically because the target is male, the book argues our legal system just kind of looks the other way. Well, how exactly does this happen? The book lays out 4 specific methods where this occurs. It ranges from straight-up deception, like lying about being on birth control, to outright theft, such as retrieving a discarded condom. Then there's breach of contract, where legal signed agreements around sperm donation are later just completely ignored. And finally, surprise paternity, where verbal assurances of no risk during a casual encounter end up in a legally binding 18-year financial commitment. The common thread in all the whole shebang: one party is deliberately misrepresenting the reproductive outcome to the other. Now, here is where things get wild from a legal standpoint. The author points out a fascinating reality. Once a child exists, courts almost universally shift their entire focus to the best interest of the child. And what this standard practically means is that the method of conception, even if it involved explicit fraud or theft, becomes completely irrelevant in the eyes of the law. The man is essentially on the hook, entirely regardless of how the conception actually occurred. And it's not just everyday guys dealing with this. The book notes that this kind of entrapment is now a widely recognized professional risk for athletes, actors, and musicians. In fact, their legal teams actively warn them that they are high-value targets. Why? Because in many jurisdictions, paternity guarantees way more than just basic child support. It can trigger massive lifestyle maintenance payouts that are calculated against the father's fame and wealth. Parenthood, the author warns, is increasingly being leveraged as a literal financial strategy. So all of this culminates in what the author dubs the great gray zone, exposing a really profound legal asymmetry. Let's just look at the balance for a second. A woman can unilaterally choose abortion or choose birth without the father's consent. A man, however, has zero comparable legal power in either direction. He can't compel birth, he can't prevent it, and he certainly can't opt out. He is completely stripped of agency, left with only 2 options: compliance or consequence. To really put this into perspective, let's look at a real-world case study from the text. So, a man privately agreed to donate sperm to a couple, and everyone involved signed a mutual no-liability agreement. It was all above board. But years later, the couple separated and sought government assistance. Well, the state stepped in and completely invalidated their private agreement, simply because a licensed physician hadn't performed the insemination, and they aggressively pursued the donor for child support anyway. Mutual consent up front ended in forced financial liability down the road. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces keep changing. The author argues this legal chaos also severely disrupts the sperm donor industry itself. Decades ago, men were promised consequence-free, anonymous donations. But today, the advent of modern DNA testing like 23andMe has completely shattered those promises. Anonymous donors are being identified, contacted by dozens of children, and even sued for rights to know. The book warns that the more we commodify sperm, essentially treating reproduction like a vending machine, the less we think about the long-term human consequences. To really grasp the root cause of this imbalance, the book actually connects this back to its first chapter. The author argues that modern consent laws didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They emerged right alongside birth control technologies that initially severed sex from consequence.
This created a cultural environment where sex was reduced from a sacred bond to a casual contract. Ultimately, life itself became viewed as optional, sometimes inconvenient, and easily discarded.
And honestly, this also loops right back into the themes we explored in Chapter 5. The text makes the case that this profound legal and cultural imbalance isn't just a matter of being unfair, it breeds deep systemic resentment. It is actively fueling a growing movement of men who are completely withdrawing from relationships, from marriage, and from societal institutions altogether. They're just walking away from systems they feel demand massive duty and sacrifice, but absolutely refuse to grant them basic fairness or dignity.
So what's the big takeaway here? Ultimately, the author's core thesis really culminates in this idea. Our modern framework of consent has been corrupted. The book argues that in our current legal system, we aren't actually honoring consent. We're weaponizing it. We're using it selectively to assign blame and obligation. The text strongly advocates for a major cultural shift, moving away from consent as a weapon and returning to consent as a covenant, which means a true mutual recognition of enduring rights and responsibilities.
The text actually wraps up this section by calling for a return to a better ethic, boldly stating, "True consent is not a game. It is not a slogan. It is not a weapon. It is a covenant." The author argues that true consent absolutely has to apply to everyone, male and female alike, and it has to extend way beyond the mere act of sex, right through to the biological consequences that inevitably follow.
So as we move forward toward later chapters that examine these broader cultural consequences, I want you to ask yourself, if we continue treating human life and reproductive materials simply as a commodity, does it ultimately erode our own humanity? It's a heavy question, but one we need to reflect on. Remember, you can dive much deeper into this, explore the interactive companion site, and support the author over at pervertingourreproductivenature.com.